UCLA has played one of the toughest schedules to this point, and it doesn't get any easier with Penn State looming this Saturday. This is Locked On. This is a Locked On crossover episode with Locked On Nittany Lions and Locked On UCLA. I am Zack Seyko. He is Zack Anderson-Yoxsimer, and we are talking about Penn State versus UCLA, looking at this game in depth. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. We'd appreciate it if you left a like on this crossover episode, but more importantly, let us know your thoughts down in the comments section. Key matchups you're looking at. If you have a score prediction, let us know, because we're going to tell you all of our thoughts in this preview episode. Zack of Locked On UCLA, I want to start with this. Is this a blowout type of game? Because the spread certainly indicates that it's 28.5 in favor of Penn State. UCLA is playing a noon kickoff, which would be 9 a.m. Pacific time for the Bruins. And they've, like I said, I started off the show that they played a daunting schedule. Penn State is a college football playoff contending type of team, and UCLA has gone everywhere. They just played Oregon. But then before that, they traveled to LSU. They've been to Hawaii. Indiana put up an impressive performance against them. It just has not been good for the Bruins to this point, and it doesn't get any easier with a time slot that is 9 in the morning, essentially.
Yeah, UCLA, they've tried to hit every time zone possible. I'm not sure. They might. I think by the year's end, they will have hit just about every time zone you can probably get, playing college football this year. Going to Hawaii, Pacific. I think they'll get the Mountain time zone. I have to go back and check that. But they've tried to hit every time zone this year. The spread, it's big. UCLA has not been favored now in 4 straight games. That might be for the rest of the season. This is the biggest spread UCLA has faced the entire season as an underdog. Ironically, though, I'll tell you, Zack, UCLA's covered the last couple of games as huge, huge underdogs.
Yes,
just don't look at the Indiana
against
game.
Oregon.
Yeah, and against LSU, barely.
So that's a good point. And I thought they looked good in the LSU matchup, but these games start to stack up. Jet lag is a real thing. I know these are football players. I know they are at the peak of their athleticism and their fitness. But at the end of the day, these are also college athletes. So while college football is moving away from that amateurism to an extent, they're not professionals that do this on a week-by-week basis. This is all brand new, too. The conference realignment and everything else. I just feel like the deck is stacked against UCLA in this matchup because Penn State is a physically imposing team, more so than people, even myself, more so than people are giving them credit for. And we discussed in our early look-ahead episode for the crossover that UCLA is just not very good in the trenches, offensively and defensively, and Penn State is. Penn State's offensive line is proving to be better and better each and every week. And I thought the defensive line, especially in the interior, was one of Penn State's best position groups on this team.
The only thing I remember I kept hearing about UCLA, SC, Washington, Oregon, when you get to the Big Ten, do you have what it takes up front? And unfortunately for UCLA, it comes a year after a defense where they were physical. They would have been able to impose things physically on defense last year. They lose Danton Lynn. They lose their outstanding defensive line and some key pieces who transferred out in the secondary. They were a physical defense last year. They have some holdovers, but it was supposed to be a decline defensively. Offensively, you lose Chip Kelly and an offensive line that last year couldn't handle life in the Pac-12. They struggled in moments against Coastal Carolina in their opener. It's an offensive line that was already weak to begin with, and they're trying to recruit to fix that in the future. And we hope that, all right, they could run the ball last year, but under a new offensive coordinator, everything has just been in flux for a team that was supposed to not be so bad offensively like they've been to start.
Would you say that UCLA's defense or offense holds them back as a team? Because James Franklin has said this, that complementary football is key. When one side of the football is able to help out the other side, you can play a full team type of game. Is it UCLA's defense or is it the offense that is really holding this team back overall that puts them in a spot where Vegas looks at them and confidently says, yes, this is a 4-touchdown deficit even before the game kicks off?
1,000% it's the offense, right? Because you could think you need one or the other, right? If you're a super strong defensive team, you could grind it out, and next thing you know, you might see what Kentucky did to Ole Miss the other week, right?
Michigan.
Right, and then you could see Michigan. They do different things. So then if you also have a great offense, if you go like Big 12 shootouts, then you can hang a little bit.
Yeah.
But UCLA, knowing coming to this year, that wasn't going to be the defense's job. It was last year, but the offense was. We have a lot of talented skill positions. You got a returning quarterback who took a hold of the job, an offensive line that had some decent pieces, and you hope they would hold up. Then it's been awful. Like, UCLA is one of the worst third down conversion teams in the country. They can't run the ball, although they've been figuring it out a little bit, right? They slowly, little bitty steps, right? They haven't just blown up for 200 yards, and they won't do that, I think, against Penn State. And then it's a quarterback who, with all the receivers, all the linemen, has no time to throw. He sometimes make a poor decision or two, and the offense just isn't working. You see some plays, and there's nowhere for Garbers to throw. So when you got nowhere to go, you've got no time to throw, you can't run the ball, that's a lot of pressure on the quarterback's shoulders when he doesn't exactly have anywhere to go with football.
And I think that's a good point. A defense that probably would be a lot better if the offense could just carry the workload a little bit. But when it's quick 3-and-outs, short drives, and the defense, even if they make a stand, they got to go back out there when they're already tired as it is. And Penn State can do one or the other. I feel like the explosive offense, the passing game can be a lot more explosive, and it's shown that. Now, granted, it was West Virginia, it was Bowling Green, it was Kent State. Illinois kind of took that away. It definitely limited it. But then there was the ground game where they would sustain 8, 9, 10 play drives, and they were physical. So they can do one or the other. You really can't sell out for one half of the game plan or not. The offense can go really quick, or they can slow it down and give some time for the defense as well. So truly, when coaches say football is won up front, that is the key matchup here for Penn State versus UCLA on both sides of the football. The O-line and the D-line versus the opposite of it, the other O-line and the other D-line here. And Penn State just has a massive advantage over both sides of it. Zach, let's go back to what we started with in this opening segment. Is this a blowout game in your mind between Penn State and UCLA?
It certainly looks like it. Of course, I think we'll probably touch on it, but it really depends about the quarterback situation for UCLA. Ethan Garbers was knocked out of the last game. He has not played in practice the first 2 practices of the week for UCLA. And Deshaun Foster, I think, is being a little mum. He's come out and said Garbers is number 1 in the depth chart this week. That is what he's come out and said. And to this point, when we're recording, that's the thought, even though he hasn't practiced. If he shows up and he toughens up and he can play, nobody can question the toughness. Garbers in the LA Bowl, he was not supposed to play last year. And then he came off the bench and led them to victory, right? So he's done this before, but he was clearly not 100%. If he plays, I'm confident UCLA covers. And this is one of those weird games like the last couple of weeks where they should be down big, but they're in it late before Penn State pulls away. If Garbers doesn't play and it's to the backup Justin Martin, it will be all caps ugly, I think.
Okay, so let's talk about just that. Yes, reports have surfaced that Ethan Garbers might not be available against Penn State, but he is going to try to play. What happens if he doesn't play in this game? What happens if he only plays a little bit of this game and is taken out for the backup QB? Let's talk about UCLA's quarterback situation and how that could impact the game for the spread, for the total, the entire margin of victory. That's coming up next here on our Locked On crossover with Locked On Nittany Lions and Locked On UCLA. Today's crossover episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Hey, NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. It's convenient, it's simple, it's easy, and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's right, guaranteed. And all you got to do is place your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. And if you look over at FanDuel, you can see the lines for Penn State versus UCLA. As we are talking about this game in depth, FanDuel has Penn State as a minus 27.5 point favorite. The spread keeps moving back and forth, and the total has moved to 46.5. So now there's some line movement on both the spread and the over-under. If you like those lines, you can bet them at FanDuel.com. Again, that's FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Ethan Garbers is not 100%. He is clearly the best quarterback that UCLA has available. Then there's the backup, Justin Martin, who is a former four-star quarterback. I think according to 24/7 had a 90 overall grade. He certainly has the look of a college quarterback, at least when he was coming out of high school, 6'4", 200 pounds. He has all the athleticism, but Zack from Locked On UCLA, you know this quarterback depth chart very well, and you have some concerns if Martin were to come into this game to replace Garbers, either to start a full 4 quarters or if he came in off of the bench if Garbers could not finish the game.
It just looks like Justin Martin has a bit of happy feet, right? There's a clear gap for the UCLA depth chart. Last year, Chip Kelly was like, we've got 3 quarterbacks. And I think the late John Madden said, if you have 2 quarterbacks, you have none. Well, then UCLA had 3 last year, so they had none. Garbers eventually pulled away, and he was, the best option. So that meant Martin last year was the 4th on the depth chart. Those 2 quarterbacks left because Garbers was the starter. So you're taking last year's 4th string quarterback, putting him up there, and, arguably the best passer, I think, on this team could be a Chase Griffin, and that he's just buried on the depth chart. He's the best thrower, I think, on this UCLA team, but he won't be playing. He's a smaller quarterback. It's a size thing, right? He just doesn't have the mobility behind this line. Martin does have the athleticism to move around. I'm just not sure if you face a Penn State team that just brought relentless pressure against Illinois, some of their best pressure all season, and a UCLA O-line that clearly has been dominated by LSU and was severely hurting against the Oregon defensive front. If Martin's not confident where he wants to go, I'm a little worried, right? Now, maybe UCLA can pull shades of what Arizona State did to them last year when they didn't have enough to protect, what Arizona State did to UCLA last year. Swinging gate offense, swinging gate. And it worked. And they upset UCLA to one of the most embarrassing losses I've ever seen in person in the last 20 to 30 years for UCLA. And that includes all the blowouts they've faced here or whenever, right? So what does UCLA do to nullify the Penn State pressure? They got to put Justin Martin into good situations. But they can't run the ball, so they can't help out their inexperienced quarterback. That's why I think if Martin's quarterback, it won't be pretty.
And I think that you can scheme a lot of things. Eric Bieniemy is one of the best offensive coordinators purely, whether he's at the college level or the pro level. He's been on Super Bowl winning teams with the Kansas City Chiefs. He's worked with Patrick Mahomes, and you and I have discussed that, how this system might just be a little too overly complicated. So how much do you want to dumb down the system to a point to where it even helps Ethan Garbers or Justin Martin, whichever the quarterback is, and you don't really have anything to bail them out, to give Penn State headaches? Okay, so Penn State actually defends the run very well. They are currently top 5 in terms of yards per carry. So something that UCLA already struggles with, Penn State is pretty elite to defend against. And then a quarterback, so you say that comfortability, confidence is kind of the biggest key here. Can Martin, is he at least a decent passer? Let's say he's a 5-star confidence, 10 out of 10 against Penn State. He's just going to leave it all out there on the football field. What can Martin do? What is his best attribute to at least make the offense for UCLA interesting going up against Penn State's defense?
I just say his athleticism, right? He hasn't been in many games. He's coming in mop-up duty. He has had very limited action, right? When UCLA went down the depth chart to get a quarterback, when they're down to their 3rd string against ASU last year, they went to Chase Griffin over Justin Martin when they needed someone to throw the ball late. So I haven't seen him when he's throwing, whether it's against NC Central. I think he threw a pick last year in FCS, HBCU school, early in 23. He's clearly the backup because UCLA has quite a few freshmen behind him, quite a few youngsters in this quarterbacking system. The job, I think, in 25 will be given for UCLA's incoming freshman, big commit, 4-star Madden Iame. But this is a chance for Martin, if he gets this opportunity, to solidify next year's job or realize, hey, this isn't what I'm coming out to be. I think he can move. When I've seen him throw in very limited opportunities in games, I just haven't been confident. And that was against, I think, much weaker competition.
Now let's flip it over to Penn State's offense versus Penn State's defense. And Zack, I want to know your opinion on Drew Aller, because you say that you have your concerns about him, and something that we talk about, footwork with Justin Martin. Drew Aller, at times, he doesn't have perfect footwork. He's been much improved compared to last season, but showed shades of the old Drew Aller from a season ago in that game against Illinois. Penn State did win by 2 touchdowns, but showed some old tendencies that I thought were in the past. But Penn State's offense, again, clear overall mismatch for UCLA's defense. One, fatigue, that's what I'm looking at. Noon kickoff, but UCLA just going through opponents like Oregon, LSU, Indiana's proving to be a lot better. The travel that is involved in all of that. And then you combine that to go up against another stout team, another physical team, when it's not, the timing is not ideal of all of this. You have to fly. If this was at UC, if this was another California game for Penn State, not USC, if this was a UCLA home game, bit of a different story, but now you got to travel again for a 6-hour plus plane ride. Penn State gets the benefit of being able to stay at home. They have most of their star players available outside of KJ Winston. Most of the guys that are going to be key contributors on this team are available. I think they're going to run the ball and be physically imposing. If the defensive line isn't able to handle it, they're just going to continue to run the football. Andy Kotelnicki said he doesn't care if he has to run the ball 60 times, if he has to throw it 60 times. They're not going to need to throw it 60 times. Penn State will run the ball effectively and lean on a Nicholas Singleton and a Katron Allen and say, UCLA, we're going to dare you to stop this ground game.
Yeah, I think we were discussing before, we're trying to look and decide how decent is this UCLA run defense, right? They're amongst the top 35 in yards per game.
They're not bad. They're not bad.
And they have a 3.5 yards per carry, which is not horrible. Mm-hmm. They faced Oregon, and when I saw an Oregon team, probably the first team all season that prides themselves on running the ball first. Rourke torched them in the air. Hawaii throws the ball. LSU really wanted to get Nussmeier out throwing the football. Oregon was the first team that said, hey, we love to throw it. We'll have our little short passes. We'll go deep. They had Tez Johnson, but we want to run the ball. And they were physical. And UCLA handled it to a point, but it was clear. You looked at the line of scrimmage, Oregon could hand it off and they dive forward for 5 yards. Wasn't every single play, but if Penn State's going to do it over and over, by the time the game comes to an end, the Nittany Lions will probably worn down this UCLA defense if they have been on the field again and again and again if the offense isn't doing anything, right? So I think for UCLA to have a chance in this game, it's to have that first drive where you stuff the run a couple of times and force a Drew Aller mistake. But the one thing Penn State can count on is first 4 games of the season for UCLA. Every single opening drive has ended in a touchdown for the opposition. And that's a tough way to play complementary football.
Yeah. And like you mentioned, if the defense continues to bend, eventually you're going to break wide open and score a touchdown after touchdown after touchdown for a Penn State team that's just going to be better rested. And we'll talk about this more in the next segment. I firmly believe that Penn State looks at this as an opportunity to continue to build out its depth, to get the backups in, to get the freshmen, because they're in a look-ahead spot where it's USC and then eventually Wisconsin and Ohio State. Those games, I'm not saying they're looking past UCLA. It's the 1-0 mentality. But I think everybody understands that USC is the tougher matchup at this point as opposed to UCLA. At the end of the day, and you mentioned that Drew Aller is going to have to make a mistake. Well, he doesn't make mistakes. He either protects he has an incompletion. He doesn't take sacks very often. He doesn't throw interceptions very often. A UCLA defense that just doesn't force turnovers as it is. So
he won't take a sack because UCLA doesn't sack anybody since week 1. So he probably won't take a sack in this game either.
So the wide receivers will have time to get open if they need to turn to the aerial attack. For Penn State, this is a really good matchup to fix some small things, maybe test some new things, build some depth in this game. UCLA, again, just going through the matchups that they have gone through before, another plane trip, a noon kickoff. I don't see them lasting 4 quarters. And even if Penn State does rotate some of the backups in, I still feel like to an extent UCLA's they're just gonna be gassed. They're just gonna be exhausted.
Yeah, the travel's been something. Of course, this is the year where they get 2 byes. That's how the schedule is baked into college football this year. You get 2 byes. Everybody does, unless you're Hawaii, and you get 3 byes this year, which is absurd, but they travel so much. UCLA, what happens is they give up an opening touchdown. Then the offense is behind the 8 ball every single time. And then next thing you know, they're down 2 scores. They got to go for it 4th and short at midfield. And then the defense is, they've made their adjustments, but it's a short field. The team's either going to get 3 points or a short field for a touchdown. Yeah. And then by the time they figure it out, teams are just running the football. So the defense looks a lot better than it should be, or they figured it out. You're down 17-0. You need your offense to score the ball, right? So it's just kind of the same formula again and again, where they have brief stretches, but they've never been able to put, in my mind, a full 3 quarters of football, let alone 4.
And I think that's going to be even more difficult to do this time around. Now, Zach, let's wrap it all, put it all together. Final segment, we'll talk about how we think this game's going to unfold, other key matchups, key players that we expect to have big days for both Penn State and UCLA. And we'll wrap that up in the final segment here on this Locked On Crossover episode. So I think Penn State wins. Penn State wins convincingly. I can't see UCLA playing a full 4 quarters here, just not the way that this aligns. And I think UCLA is better than people might give them credit for. They played the second toughest schedule according to Pro Football Focus. This is just not an ideal scenario for the Bruins. New head coach, new offensive system. Your quarterback, the UCLA's quarterback might play in the game. He might not. I don't know that he's going to finish the game regardless. If he's not 100% and Penn State's pass rush sets the tone early, I imagine that he's just going to get benched to say, hey, we still have a Big Ten conference slate and a full schedule ahead of us to where we need Garbers. Zach, if you're telling me that UCLA should not be confident in its backup quarterback, so why risk the availability of Garbers when this game is going to be out of reach, probably sooner rather than later? I look to Penn State getting in its freshman players that have a lot of potential, but just don't have the experience yet. Other backup players to preserve Penn State's starters as well. So there's that opportunity. Do you think UCLA, maybe late in the game with some of Penn State's backups, Kent State wouldn't be able to do this because I think Penn State's backups would start on that Kent State team. But UCLA, if UCLA has a lot of its starters still in and Penn State turns to its 3rd, maybe even its 4th stringers, there's an opportunity. Like you said, you're confident in a cover. I wonder if this is so far out of reach that UCLA might not be able to get that backdoor cover.
It depends. I mean, it just all depends who starts at quarterback for me, right? If it's Martin, then I think UCLA is in trouble unless Penn State literally sets the alarms too late or something in the morning, right? If it's Garbers, for him to play, he's waited his whole career to play. Started at Washington, transferred, had to wait behind Dorian Thompson-Robinson, had his opportunity, then he had to flip-flop with current Oregon Duck Dante Moore because he was the 5-star freshman and Chip couldn't decide between the two. So he's like, this is my opportunity. I stayed here and I want to win this job. I'm a SoCal kid. I'm here to go play at Penn State. I want to gut it out. And sometimes to get a program-defining moment, whether it's a surprising win, which nobody expects at Penn State, or a turnaround part of the season where you play well and then you have a winnable back half of the schedule with more games I think UCLA should be competitive in than Oregon, Indiana, Penn State have been, LSU. It takes those gutty performances, right? Those gutsy, got to fight through the injuries and make it a lot closer to put a scare. What UCLA needs is that performance to put these naysayers in the fan base down, because it's either, hey, it's been 6 months, Deshaun needs more time, or fire everybody now. That's where it's at. That's where my head is so confused. We're all lost. Is it meant to make sense? Who knows? It's not. It's really unprecedented to see Chip just leave and go across, get enough point here, go across and get a whole new system. So for me, it's just, this is kind of like, where is this team at? You've had 3 straight games you've lost by 3 scores or more, 2 of which at home in Big Ten play. What is the mental makeup of this team? Do they come in and give themselves a game with your quarterback hurt in one of the toughest environments, if not the toughest environment in college football, although they've already played in one of the others called Death Valley? How do they show up? And if they play a quality game for a few quarters, I will be very happy with their effort again. And then I'll be more disappointed later in the season if they can't string a win or 2 together against lesser competition. I think UCLA might have a chance against Minnesota, although they just played Michigan tough, right? I think the Bruins make this competitive for a couple of quarters like they've done. They cover from the beginning. If Martin starts, I have very limited confidence that they do cover.
I think when I look at the matchup against UCLA, I think at some point, I don't think Garbers is going to finish the game. Even if he starts, I think we might see a half, maybe, of Martin, because It's just Penn State's not going to obviously intentionally try to injure Garbers, but if the offensive line is really that bad for UCLA and Garbers is not 100%, Abdul Carter, Denai Dennis Sutton are going to get through right away. It's going to be a big hit on the sack. I think UCLA is going to be like, you know what? This game's just kind of, it's going to get out of reach. We need to look long term at this. Garbers needs to come out. They're not going to raise the white flag, but there's almost essentially, you just have to look. There's more winnable games. There's still a full season ahead of you that you don't want to sacrifice just because you want to try to make a statement against Penn State. To move towards key players in that same tone, I'm looking at Penn State's backups, rotational players that need to establish themselves on the depth chart. I think of the true freshman safety, and Zack, you might be familiar with them, but Dejon Lane, who was had the green light. They were going to burn his red shirt right out of the gate. He needs to get that. He needs to get that extra playing time so that he's ready to go for USC, Wisconsin, Ohio State, even Washington. That 4-game stretch is going to be difficult for Penn State. I look to some of the other freshmen like a Luke Reynolds, who's at tight end, another true freshman, and Anthony Specca at linebacker. Those guys where they have depth concerns because of either injuries or just a lack of players to start this season. At tight end, linebacker, and at the safety spot in the defensive back room, those are the players that stand out to me in this game for Penn State. As far as the star players go, Nicholas Singleton and Katron Allen could easily each have 100 yards both on the ground for each of them. They're also going to play more in this game because they just had a serious injury to their third running back on the depth chart. So I don't know that they're going to turn to the other true freshman, in this case, Quentin Martin, if they don't believe that he's ready to go. So Singleton and Allen, by nature, are going to be in this game a little bit longer than they should be, and that's just going to allow them to pad the stat sheet. I wonder if Penn State gets over 300 yards in this game on the ground.
It would be interesting, to see how tough this the UCLA front defensively is. I would say, looking to the Bruins defensively, they spent a lot in NAL to keep Jay Tuia out of the portal and going to Texas. Of course, you think about life in Austin right now versus life in Westwood or playing in Pasadena. That's very different. But the Bruins thought he was so important that they kept him there. And then Sharif Say, he's a guy that was a little late to getting into camp, getting cleared, transferring over, made a play when he was in the game. If he gets more run time, maybe UCLA has a better opportunity on the D-line that just has a lot less depth this year than they had last year when they had an NFL first-rounder, twin pass rushers who are both really good. And I look at the linebacking room. You have Schlesinger, who's putting up a lot of stats, but I think the big man is Kane Medrano. Secondary for the Bruins defense, as I've said, UCLA, they want to have a chance to make this one fun early. They need to play. Well, Brian Addison made a play against his former team last week, Oregon, right? He practically knocked out a receiver, drew the ire of all the Ducks fans, and then in the same motion at the end of the half, pick six, and all of a sudden a 35-3 game turned into a 28-10 game at the half, and it was weird. But the secondary needs to make a play if they want to make this one fun. So Addison is my look at for UCLA secondary. And then offensively, it really depends on who's the quarterback and if the offensive line can play better or they do something to mask the talent disparity, the physical presence that they're just missing up front. Can they use that with some athleticism of a probably hobbling quarterback or the more athletic Martin?
It'll be interesting to see how many points Penn State can put up in this game. I think Penn State easily scores 30. Can they push it to that 40-point total? And then can UCLA even get to double digits? That's kind of, I look at games, Zach, and I say, okay, can this team score 10? Can they score 20? Can they score 30? Can they score 40? And that's where I kind of put it at for Penn State. For UCLA, can they score 10? Well, I don't know. I feel like they need a couple breaks to go their way. But I think we've had a good all-around discussion to pinpoint every major discussion point in this game of how it will unfold. UCLA is just in a different circumstance versus Penn State. And at the end of the day, I think it's just unfortunate timing for the Bruins because I do believe that they're better. I do believe that they will surprise some teams in that final stretch of the season. But Saturday is just not that game for them. Also, don't forget, if you're a Penn State fan, it is a stripe-out game. So yes, Zach, that's a big deal. UCLA is being welcomed into the Big Ten for Penn State with a stripe-out for this noon kickoff. And weather should be fair. I think weather's going to be in the mid-60s, overcast. It's been pretty rainy here in Pennsylvania, but it seems like everything's going to hold off for this game, and it should be a relatively nice day. That's going to do it for this crossover episode with Locked On UCLA and Locked On Nittany Lions. He is Zack Anderson-Yoxsimer of Locked On UCLA. I'm Zack Seyko of Locked On Nittany Lions. Got a score prediction? Let us know down in the comments section. Zack, it was great to catch up and preview this game, not once, but twice in these crossover episodes. Thank you so much for your time, and good luck to UCLA for the remainder of the season and your coverage. And thanks so much for making Locked On Nittany Lions and Locked On UCLA your first listen and watch every single day. For your second listen and watch, you got to check out Locked On College Football with host Spencer McLaughlin. Game recaps, game previews, discussing the latest news, analysis throughout the week to get you ready for that latest slate of college football games. That's why it's called Locked On College Football. It's available on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.